Hey guys, my name is Randy and I'm a believer who struggles with Randy. Hi Randy. But really, today I'm a new man because of Celebrate Recovery. You know, and as I share, I will tell you that I'm a believer who struggles with anger. And I'm a believer who struggles with chemical dependency at one time. But today that's not my main struggle. My main struggle is everyday life. Self-esteem, food addiction, and anger especially. I was born in a normal way. Yeah, I wasn't found under a rock or didn't come out of an egg. But I was born to a husband and wife, man and woman. And I was a little baby and everything was normal until my life quickly changed. At a year and a half old, my mom and dad separated and then divorced. That was hurt number one. I moved in with my grandmother and grandfather Gwen, who was my mom's parents. They were Christian folks. They were fun. My grandmother Gwen would bake biscuits and give me a big old homemade biscuit, and that's one of my fondest memories. Also bringing in a tub of 100 frogs. My uncles did, and they were jumping around her kitchen floor, and her kitchen floor was plywood. They had one bedroom which had 7 beds. One was there, or 7 beds. One was theirs, and 6 other beds where everyone slept in the same room. And they had a sheet around their bedroom, basically. But it was a fun time. It was a great time. My granddad took me fishing. He was a godly man. He did everything, and he pushed it right up to the limit of cussing, but it wasn't cussing. And his key word was "Dad jang it." I never figured out or knew what that was, but those are some good memories as a child. And so from about a year and a half old to 3 years, I'm giving you some groundwork of how I became who I became, and then I'm going to show you through Celebrate Recovery who I am today. But anyway, it was some good memories, and then my mom remarried. The man that she married had family in South Carolina. So all of a sudden my world was torn apart again, and we moved away from all the family that I knew, all the fun things I knew, all the memories I knew, and we moved away to where I knew no one. The only 2 kids I knew was my stepbrothers, or my stepbrother and my stepsister. And during that time, in my step study, I've been through 3 step studies, by the way, but in my second step study, it was my first step study, I really identified that between 4.5 years old when she remarried to when I was about 6.5, there was a 1.5 years, 2 years that I had no memories of. And I don't know if there were some things that happened that I just blocked out, but I had 2 memories basically. One of them was about playing in the backyard and jumping off of a propane tank, and I bit my tongue. And then we ran over and ate crab apples. I don't know if y'all have eaten crab apples, but crab apples on the bit tongue, that's like stink, right? But that was one memory. And the other memory I have is not a memory, it's more of a feeling of a memory, and that was feeling unloved. So I found hurt number 2. I didn't feel loved. I was away from my family that I knew. My grandfather who taught me how to fish, and my grandma who baked biscuits and saved me from being bitten by a rattlesnake. I mean, I had some hurts in that, and in that time my mom and I were abused. So my mom divorced, she moved back home, and I don't remember much about that guy. Kind of oddly, his name was Norman, and before her last name was Norman, but his first name was Norman. And he was a good man, and my mom has told me he's a good man. They didn't stay married very long, about 6 months, and they divorced, and I don't know, like I said, didn't remember much of that. But there was a series of feeling solid then not, then feeling like I had a place then not, and that's where insecurity came in my life. But then my aunt, who we called Mama June, moved in with us. And they moved in as roommates, and she's a Christian woman, and she was the first person I ever heard say my Jesus as in first tense, like he was hers and she was his, because I'd been brought up in church and I had an idea who God was, but she was the only one that ever said my Jesus. And we had some great memories, and all of a sudden life felt good again. We would take vacations. Some of my most fond photos are in my mom's photo album, where my mom and my aunt and I and my cousin, who her name was Michelle, we were in that specific names, but anyway, Michelle and I were raised as brothers and sisters. But one of my fondest photos is my mom and my aunt, myself and my cousin in 4 go-karts lined up, fixed to take off. And my mom and my aunt was dressed in platinum wigs, which was really big at that day, and Blues Brothers glasses. And we was all about to race on go-karts. We had a blast. Those are some good memories. But then addiction 1, 2, and 3 happened. At 9 years old, I was introduced to sex through a cousin. And that was a feeling as a young boy that I had no idea the power that it had at that time. By the time I was 14 years old, I had a pornography addiction and was introduced to magazines. And that addiction grew and grew. And it's also the same time in that 14-year-old time period that I used my first drug, which was cigarettes. We would steal those cigarettes and sneak outside and smoke them. They were Tarrington 100s or Winston Golds, and they were very, very strong, especially for a kid. But that was my first addiction that came through. And then I started drinking wine at 15, addiction number 3, and then 4 rather, and then addiction number 5 came at 16 when I started smoking pot. By the time I was 18, the first habit formed. That habit was doing any drug that was on the market. It didn't matter. If it was in the circle where I could get it, I would get it and I would do it. And I not only did it, I sold it. I never was one of those guys that spend all my money on that stuff. I would sell it to, support my own habit. So I was taking a risk of prison. But the habit had already been made. 3 weeks before I was 19 years old, I got married for the first time. She was the high school sweetheart, but it really wasn't a sweetheart situation. But I basically married her because she partied and I partied. And birds of a feather flock together. And then I found out that about a year and a half later she was unfaithful to me and had been several times. That was hurt, number 3. We had a son and we got divorced after I caught her with another man in front of my house in our driveway after coming home early from work. My son was about a year and a half old. I gathered my things and I left. Addiction number 5 came, or 6 rather, came when I started working in a bar. That fed my desire for attention, for acceptance, and offered counterfeit love. And that was from Satan. It also gave me a whole list and long line of friends because I was the guy that knew where the drugs were. That was my reputation. If I didn't have it, I knew where we could get it. And so that's where the fake friends came from. I met my second wife in the bar. She was a bar back. She said she was pregnant. We got married. 3 weeks later, I found out she wasn't. And she made a plea, well, I guess you're going to divorce me now. But we stayed married. But in that marriage, we had a wonderful little daughter. Her name is Amanda. And from the day that she was born, she was a daddy's girl. And hurt number 5, my second wife was unfaithful to me. Found out she was having a relationship with a guy that my daughter could only call uncle and tell me that his hair was red. And she would go over there with her and she would play with his kids and they would go in the back bedroom. And yeah. So after about $3,500 worth of counseling in 9 weeks, she said she wasn't going to do it anymore. She wasn't going to try anymore. So we again divorced. Or again I got divorced. And my daughter was about a year and a half old. It's funny how history repeated itself. I was a year and a half old. My son was a year and a half old. And my daughter was a year and a half old. So the hurt kept repeating itself. I thought it was okay. I did. I was partying my way through life. I had been led to believe that sex without being married was the norm, that partying was a way to get there, and that drugs made it easier. I worked at Union Pacific Railroad, and I stayed up all night long partying. And then the next day I would do cocaine all day long, just stay awake while working on locomotives that were running with 3,500 horsepower engines and moving parts and loose-fitting clothes. My life is a life of insanity. I'd gone to church as a kid, but didn't know who the real God was. I thought he was this big cosmic killjoy. I thought he was this big cosmic dad that was disappointed in most everything I did, and either that or uncaring at other times. I had a few friends, until a few good friends, until I stopped partying, and I found out that my attitude toward others was often a series of manipulating actions to get desired results, or acting like a friend, but my actions showed that I really wasn't. I basically used people. My breaking point came unexpectedly, and I hit bottom. Had a maintenance job at the railroad, and I hurt my back at work one day. Little did I know they would give me a UA. I failed the UA, and since I'd filed a lawsuit against the railroad for my injury, my lawyer told me I had to go to rehab or lose my court case. So I went to Bridgeway, outpatient therapy. First time I'd been in recovery, first time I'd ever been around it. I naturally went in with deceits and lies, beginning with the drug history form. I said, I just smoke pot. That's all. I just need help with that. And it's not a problem. Anybody ever said that? It's not a problem. I can handle it. But 3 weeks into the program, and this is why testimonies are so important. I don't know if I'll say just one thing that might help somebody here tonight. Just one thing you relate to. But I found my one thing in that testimony. It was a 55-year-old man that was in his 9th rehab. And he said his doctor said he was going to die unless he quit drinking. And then he went on to tell in his case history, is what it was called, instead of testimony at Bridgeway. In his case history, he shared how he witnessed his dad's death in the living room, the kitchen of their house, after his mom ran a butcher knife in his chest while he was beating her. I realized that night that I was a liar, that I'd lived a life of lies, and I was ready to step out of denial. I told my counselor as I went out the door, and I remember this so vividly. I walked up and I said, John, I need a new drug history form because I'm a liar. He said, no joke, Randy. He used a little more colorful language than that. But I told him I had to get honest. And he said, okay, the next 2 weeks, don't share, just listen. He said, because you talk too much and you think you have all the answers. So I started listening more than I talked, and at his advice, I didn't share for 2 weeks. And I asked him if I could start sharing because I realized I didn't have the answers, but I needed to get honest. So I started going to NA meetings and did my 90 and 90. But they left out the power of God, so I needed more. At the invitation of my children, they kept bugging me to death till I could go to church. So I went to church and I found a church home, and I started attending regularly. I was a single dad, raising 2 children. My 14-year-old son came to my house at the request of his mom, and my 5-year-old daughter, Amanda, I had kept, even though I was paying the child support, I still kept her, and they were my best friends during that first period of my recovery. All my friends melted away. Mostly because I shared Jesus with them. I'd invite them to recovery. I'd invite them to come with me. But they were still in their other things. But I remember one morning after I promised my kids I'd go to church. It was 98,000 degrees, at least 98. And I'm a big guy, and I'm 80 pounds lighter than I was at this time. And I was sweating bullets getting ready. I remember I snapped my pants, and when I did, the little metal thing that holds it together popped off. And I put the shirt on because I was going to a church where you had to have a tie and a coat, you know. And so I put my dress shirt on, and I buttoned it up. When I did, the top button flung off. And then I put the belt, stuffed the shirt tail in, put the belt on to cover up this one that broke, and I put the tie on, I cinched it up to cover up this one that broke. And I reached down to put my boot on, and the left foot went right in because I didn't have dress shoes, but I had dress pants on. And when I put my right foot in the right boot, and at this time, I was 34 years old. I had never had a boot tear, the upper tear from the lower. But when I put my foot in that boot, I've had heels fall off, jerk off, all kinds of soles come off, but never an upper part of the boot rip from the bottom. I know it was Satan trying to keep me from going to church. I ran my finger down through the hole from the back of the heel through the rip, put my foot in there, dropped that pair of pants over that, and I went to church. The struggle became less. It became easier and easier to make it. Satan will throw a stumbling block in my way anytime, whether it's to church, to recovery, or just to something I'm supposed to go to. But my bottom wasn't after I was homeless or lost everything. I was a single dad raising my 2 kids. I had cars and trucks and a boat and a good job, a house paid for, money in the bank from the settlement that I'd gotten from the railroad. But my bottom came when I felt the emptiness and the loneliness that had come from my selfish life. Without Jesus in my life, I had a hole that none of the things above could have ever filled. One night I had a weekend planned with this girl that I was dating. And yes, I was going to church at the time, by the way. But we had planned Satan's weekend. We were going to go out of town to Hot Springs. But she stood me up. And she again was unfaithful. Hurt number 6. That night I stayed home. My kids weren't there. I'd made plans for them to be somewhere else because I was going out for the weekend. So I stayed at home all by myself. And as that emptiness and loneliness took over, I realized I needed Christ in my life. I ended up going into my son's bedroom that had the only Christian CD that I knew of, and I plugged it in. And I started singing the words, didn't even know the words. I'd bought the CD because I went with a girl to a church because I wanted to go with a girl, not to the church, but that's just the way I rolled. But that was the only CD I knew of, a Christian CD. And I prayed, and I prayed, and I asked God to let me know the sins that I'd committed against Him. I didn't really understand what repenting was, even though I'd grown up in church. My mom and my grandmother had taken me. And my other grandparents were Christians. I didn't know what being a Christian was, even though I'd had all the experience. I had head knowledge and no heart knowledge. But that night when I got on my knees, I asked God to take away from me the desire for drugs and alcohol and easy women, because that was my addiction. My addiction was love. I had a love addiction. I had an acceptance addiction. I had a low self-esteem that I kept trying to shove things in. But that night, God filled that hole. I got up the next morning. I remember I was calling my mom. Mom, guess what? I got saved last night. She said, yeah, right. I said, no, I really gave my life to Christ, Mom. You got, yeah. You'll be back out in 6 months. No. From that day forward, I've never done an illegal drug. And in fact, I was still drinking, or not drinking on a regular basis, but when my wife and I got married, in fact, that's the next part, but I thought that alcohol was okay because it's legal, right? I thought the problem with drugs was just because it was illegal. But my wife and I got married on June the 17th, 1995. We met at church. Finally found one at the right place. And we went on a cruise for our honeymoon. But while on our cruise, we had some drinks. So as I I pastored Celebrate Recovery for a little while at Mercy's Cross, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But after CR one night, we got home, and she laid into me like a pit bull on a bone because I had said something. She said, "How can you stand up there and lie to them people about your clean time?" I said, "What do you mean? I got clean when I prayed that night when I was 34. She said, "You don't remember on the beach, Coco Loco, get your Coco Loco?" It's basically a rum daiquiri. I said, "Yeah." And I remember that day you had some too. So we both reset our sobriety date. And our sobriety date is June the 22nd, 1995, which this month, this year, that's what I'm going to say, June of this year will be 20 years clean and sober. Amen. But I was introduced to Celebrate Recovery, let me back up 20 years now, but I was introduced to Celebrate Recovery through a pastor of the church where I'd gotten saved, or where I was going when I got saved, and I became friends with him. And after about a year, he introduced me to the CR curriculum. Celebrate Recovery was only about 4 years old at the time, but it was gaining popularity in the Christian community because it was Christ-centered. It was the missing piece of the puzzle of my life. In the next 5 years, I approached 2 different churches about starting Celebrate Recovery, and neither took interest. The first one said, "You mean you're going to let prostitutes and drug addicts in our church?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "Well, they're going to steal our stuff." And I thought to myself, they're here already. They're just afraid to tell you. That's what church was then to me. But God led me to another church, and after a year, they still had taken no interest. And I went to, well, let me just keep on this right here. But through that 5 years, God led me to several people that I individually worked through the step work in the step books of Celebrate Recovery. God had a plan. In December of 2000, I got a call from my dad. It was the only time I ever heard my dad cry. He said that my little brother was in his bedroom with the lights off, that he'd come straight in and taken a shower and gone to his bedroom, but he wouldn't talk to him, and he'd never seen him like this way, never seen him this way before, and was afraid of what he might do or what might happen. I had about 5 years clean at this time. After hearing the sound in his voice, I made a 20-minute drive in 13 minutes. I found my brother in a room in the dark, and he didn't tell me what was going on. He told me he didn't know what was going on, that he was in a low place. I didn't share any scripture. I didn't read the Bible to him. I simply told him the difference that Jesus had made in my life. There's a couple that I knew that had called me and invited me to a Celebrate Recovery that had just started because they didn't know how to do it either. They knew I'd worked with it. I never led one, but they knew I knew about it. So on a night, we went to that CR and we started going to Mercy's Cross in Sherwood. It's called that church now. My brother, myself, and my wife started attending on a regular basis. And by the way, that night was predicted to freeze and sleet, but we went anyway. After a few months of attending Celebrate Recovery, the pastor of the church approached me about pastoring Celebrate Recovery there, and I accepted the position. You know, the program has helped me so much. I'll say that after a little while, we started our first men's step study, and Pastor Elbert was the first one that led a step study, by the way. I didn't. But I went through my first men's step study, and that's where the real healing began. Principle 3 was my change point when I got a real grip on turning my life over to Christ's care and control, and how getting honest and stepping out of denial and realizing there was a God that could restore me to sanity, my life changed. there were so many changes in my life that came so quickly after I got into recovery, and we were bouncing back about 5 years because I started reconnecting with my dad and with my mom, and because I'd made them so mad and hurt them so bad. And there was one thing that I did intentionally, and at 34 years old, I started saying yes ma'am and no sir to my mom and dad, and I still do that today. Show them the respect that they should have. But now, at this point, and now today, my relationships are transparent. I'm not seeking anything from anyone selfishly. I have real friends that I have made through the years of being involved in Celebrate Recovery. My old life of manipulation has been replaced with helping and sacrificing and serving others. Others return the friendship because CR taught me how to live a genuine life of recovery. 24/7, 365. To be the same person in the room by myself as I am today as I give you this testimony. Not just staying clean and sober, but living a life to the fullest through my relationship with Jesus Christ. The time of living in the knowledge of God and making Him whole, I wanted Him to be everything that I could let Him be. See, before, God was a God that I wanted Him to be who I wanted to be so I could justify the way I was living. Even trying to justify smoking pot because, oh, He says you're supposed to dominate all the herbs and all this stuff, I tried to make Him the God I wanted Him to be, but through Celebrate Recovery, that way of thinking had been replaced by reserving a daily time with Him for prayer, for meditation, and Bible study, that I might know His will for my life. There's a lot of benefits that I've received from this program. Getting in touch with my real self by staying for the groups, listening to others, and working through the participant guides in, as I said before, 3 step studies. In fact, the 3rd step study was the best step study, and there was only 3 guys. That step study, I got more connected to the inner person that I am and God wanted me to be, and who God has made me through this process of years of recovery. So I encourage you, if you've been through a step study, go through another one. If you've never been through one, go through one. And get honest and get real and answer those questions as deep as you can. Today, I have a healthy self-esteem, have a healthy view of who God is, and also how He sees me. I drew a picture once of God and who I thought He was, and it's this big hand coming out, and there's this guy in the middle of the desert. He's like Curly Q, and the cussing with the cartoons, little asterisks and all that stuff. He's like, and this big arm coming down like this, and it had a suit coat and a cufflink that said God on it, and he's going to thump the guy on his head. That was my picture of God. But that's not the God that I know now. I know a God that loves me, and even in all my failures, He accepts me. He takes me back even when I mess up. Through Celebrate Recovery, I've learned a process. I've learned that recovery is not about drugs and alcohol. Those are symptoms. I've learned that recovery is about having a different way of processing our decisions. It's about a different way of treating each other. It's about different ways of honoring our relationships. It's about wholly loving people in an agape love, not conditional. Not if you do this, I'll do that. But wholly loving someone just because they're one of God's children. And I also have a good process of making decisions that does not lead me back to numbing away the pain of those decisions, but a healthy process that in those decisions draws me closer to Christ, and it doesn't drive me back into Satan's tricks. There's something I would like to say if there's any newcomers here today. First, step study, stay for groups, and lastly, most importantly, stay until the miracle happens. My name is Randy. I'm a believer who struggles. Thanks for letting me share.